Hey everyone, this is Bhanu Prakash, Product Manager at Snowflake. Today I am excited to share that Snowpark External Access with Outbound Private Link is generally available on AWS as well as Azure. What this means is using external access, you can now use private link on AWS as well as Azure to connect to resources or services that are available over private link. Secondly, for those of you who are on AWS, you can now use IAM integration as a way to authenticate the resources that support IAM authentication on AWS. Let's see this in action with a live demo. What is outbound private connectivity? As some of you who already know external access allows you to connect to any resources available on the public internet. But there are resources that are not always available on the public internet. And that's where private connectivity comes into picture. So what this allows is any resources or services that are available over cloud provider private link technology can now be connected using external access. Why this is important is that this provides a way to connect to external resources or services without traversing the internet, thereby meeting your security and compliance needs. So let's take a look at how this applies to external access in case of Snowpark. Now with external access, you create a network rule that allows you to define the set of external services or endpoints that you want to connect to. Now with private connectivity, what you do end up is creating a private endpoint which maps to an external resource in case of Azure, similarly an external service in case of AWS. Now this private endpoint is bind as part of network rule, and then the network rule and the secrets are going to be bind as part of external access integration, which means that the secret as well as the secret can be used only with that specific network URL. Now these needs to be declared as part of the UDF or a procedures, and then when you call the procedure or the UDF, which then uses the external access integration, can connect to that specific resource declared. Now let's see this end-to-end in action for AWS as well as Azure. Let's start with a demo in case of Azure, where we want to connect to an Azure SQL instance from Snowpark using outbound private connectivity. So in this case, first we are going to connect using with the assumption that Azure SQL instance is available on the public internet. So as part of that, we are going to create a network rule, a secret, as well as an external access integration. So let's go ahead and create this. And once this is created, we are going to then go ahead and create a procedure that uses the above created external access integration and then use it to connect to this SQL instance. So as part of this, I'll go ahead and create this procedure which uses the above created external access integration. And now we are going to call this procedure using the above created external access integration. As I go ahead and call this, let's go ahead and take a look at this Azure SQL instance. Let's go to the networking section within security, and as you see here, the public network access has been marked as disabled, which means my connection to the SQL instance should fail. And as you see here, I get an error that connection was denied since deny public network access is set to yes. To connect to the server, use the private endpoint from inside your virtual network, which in this case happens to be the virtual network of Snowflake. Now to do that, the first thing we'll do is creating a private endpoint. So if you click on this link, it shows you how do you create a private endpoint. And it is as easy as running a system function. So in case of AWS, you create the system function, call the system function using the provider service name and host name. And similarly, in case of Azure, you provide the resource ID, the host name as sub-resource. Now let's go ahead and provision this private endpoint in case of Azure. So as I mentioned that you have to provide the host name as well as the resource ID. So this is the host name and the resource ID and the sub resource ID. Then I create the network rule as well as the secret and then bind it together as part of external access integration. Now this is supposed to be used within a notebook. So I am setting this external access integration on the notebook. Now to take a look, in this case, I have already created the private endpoints. So I can run this system function get private link endpoints info to see what endpoints have been created and the status. So in this case, this is the private endpoint created along with the status as approved. Now let's go ahead and write another function to connect to this private and to connect to this Azure SQL instance to query the data. And now I have created this, and I need to first go ahead and set the session. And now let's go ahead and create this function. And as I create this function, let's go ahead and call this function to query the data. In this case, there is a table that already is available on the Azure SQL, and we are querying that data. So as I query this data, you see here, these are the various values available in the SQL, and it did not fail when I used the private link connectivity. Now, I also have the information up in this external access history view, which is a part of account usage view in Snowflake, that tells you the query ID, the host name, the status, the source IP, the sent bytes, as well as the received bytes, which allows you to set up monitoring to understand where the traffic is coming from and where the traffic is going, and how much bytes are transferred as part of this. Now with that, let's switch over to see a similar demo in case of AWS. So in case of AWS, I'm going to use external connectivity to connect to an S3 resource via private link. And here as well, the step one is to create a private endpoint. So in this case, I have already created a private endpoint, and using the same system function, I can see the private endpoints available in case of AWS. Now, one specific thing that I'm doing in this demo is also I'm going to use IAM as a way to authenticate to my S3 resource. Now, before I do that, let's go ahead and create a network rule with that specific S3 bucket. And then I'm going to create a security integration where I'll provide my AWS role ARM. Now, once I create this security integration, what we do is we create the AWS IAM user as well as the external ID for your account. And you can retrieve that by calling this describe security integration, which provides you the list of these two values, AWS IAM user on and then AWS external ID, that you need to put as part of your IAM role within the trust relationship. So you will see the JSON values where you need to update these IAM user as well as optionally external ID as part of the trust relationship. So in the first scenario, what I'm doing is I have not added those on AWS user on as well as the external ID, which is created as part of the security integration. So let's go ahead and create this secret, and you'll see this new type called Cloud Provider Token. And the next is I'm going to create this S3 external access integration with the above secret, and then I'm going to write a simple function to connect to S3 using the above created external access integration. And now I'm going to try to connect to S3. And as you see here, I get an error please verify that the principal and external ID are configured correctly. Now, I have created another security integration where I have correctly set the integration values, which is the IAM user as well as the external ID in my trust relationship on the IAM role. So, which in this case I am using BP underscore security underscore integration 2. Now, the second thing I am doing is adding that as part of the secret and then creating the external access integration with the same secret. Now, in this case, because the trust relationship is already configured, I'll go ahead and run the same function to be able to connect to my S3. And in this case, it shows successfully connected to AWS S3. With that, I hope you learned a little bit about the new capabilities of outbound private connectivity on AWS as well as Azure as a way to connect from your Snowpark external access. Let us know if you have any questions. In this video, we'll also have links to getting started as well as our documentation so you can get started with these two new capabilities. Thank you.